8 years after the divorce, I ran into my ex-wife and my adoptive sister in a remote little town. In the years since I'd seen them, one had become a superstar, the other the head of the powerful Prescott family, and I was running a tiny, hole-in-the-wall diner. The moment our eyes met, they both froze. Serafina, ex-wife, quickly hid a medical report behind her back. Isabel, my sister, slipped a limited edition watch she bought for her brother into her pocket. I calmly finished packing the takeout order and handed it to them with practiced courtesy. Here you are, ladies. The formal, distant address seemed to rattle them. As they were leaving, Serafina suddenly turned back. Didn't you say you'd only ever cook for me? I offered a polite, empty smile. The foolish promises of youth. They don't mean much now. Just like the people and memories I once thought I could never get over. With time, they had all faded to nothing. Through the open glass door, the noise of the street drifted in, but it couldn't dispel the frozen silence that had settled over the diner. The two women who had conspired to ruin me, to cast me out of my own home, stood at the counter, unwilling to leave. Serafina clutched the plastic bag of food, choosing her words carefully. Owen is injured and needs to recuperate. The facilities here are excellent, so we brought him to stay for a while. Mom and Dad, they came, too, she added. Do you want to see them? I shook my head, wiping a grease stain from the countertop. No, that's not necessary. Please give my regards to Mr. and Mrs. Prescott. I paused, then added, actually, it's probably best you don't mention me at all. Being associated with someone like me would only tarnish the Prescott name. At that, my adoptive sister Isabel's brow furrowed. Noah, these past few years, Noah, a young woman with streaks of red in her hair bounced into the diner, instantly latching onto my arm like a koala. I'm starving. The school cafeteria food was literal poison today. I chuckled, ruffling her hair. You say that every day, Gigi. There's a plate of your favorite shrimp scampi in the kitchen. I just made it. Go get it yourself, Gigi. Gigi just hugged my arm tighter, whining. No, I have to eat with me. Noticing that my other two visitors still hadn't left, my smile faded. Is there anything else I can get for you ladies? The message was clear, but it took them a long moment to shake their heads. Serafina seemed to drift off for a second when she heard shrimp scampi. Isabel stared at Gigi, clinging to my arm, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came out. I led Gigi into the back, the curtain falling behind us and cutting off their view. When I came out again, they were gone. Hey, Gigi said around a mouthful of shrimp. Did you know them? They weren't here to cause trouble, were they? I've seen them on TV. One's a huge celebrity, the other runs the Prescott Corporation. They're kind of a big deal. I placed another shrimp in her bowl. Just regular customers, I said with a light laugh. If I knew people like that, do you think I'd be running this little diner? I'd have moved us all into a mansion by now. Gigi giggled, then leaned in conspiratorially. I heard that Superstar's husband is the one who's sick. The whole family came all the way out here just to take care of him. Must be nice having that many people who care about you, I said calmly, wiping a grain of rice from the corner of her mouth. Oh, I knew exactly how much they doted on Owen Prescott. 8 years ago, for his sake, one of them had publicly accused me of slander and assault, sending me to prison. The other had announced to the world that I had taken my own life out of guilt, personally ensuring I was erased from the Prescott family forever. They worked in perfect, seamless harmony to cast me into a hell from which I was never meant to return. Hey, what's this? I was clearing the table when Gigi popped her head out from behind the counter, holding up a small, withered ring woven from dried grass. It was the kind you could make from weeds on the side of the road. It was stained with old dark blood. Originally it would have had a small white daisy tucked into it. It was the wedding ring Serafina had given me when we were young. Back then, she wasn't a world-famous actress. She was just a girl abandoned near the Prescott estate by her foster father as payment for a massive debt. I found her on a winter night, huddled in a corner of the wall, shivering in the snow, her thin clothes no match for the cold. Her hand had unconsciously gripped the hem of my coat. Against the wishes of my parents and my sister, I brought her home. I used my allowance to pay for a doctor, slowly pulling her back from the brink of death. And so 15-year-old Serafina stayed, becoming my little shadow. When I skipped class, she covered for me. When I got into fights, she took the punishment. When I was cornered in an alley by a group of bigger kids, she stood with me, trembling with fear, but refusing to abandon me. Later, when we fell in love, we would hide behind the wall of roses in the garden, laughing together like a pair of fools. Then, when she turned 17, a famous talent scout came to the house, begging her to become an actress. Noah, wait for me, she promised, kissing my cheek. I know I'm not good enough for you now, but when I'm a star household name, I'll be able to stand beside you as your wife. I will make it. You're the only person I ever want to marry." I knew I couldn't change her mind, so I cooked her a feast of all her favorite foods as a farewell. As she was leaving, she slipped the grass ring onto my finger. "One day, Noah, I'll give you the biggest, most beautiful wedding ring in the world." My parents and sister never liked her, but they didn't want to see me unhappy. They used the family's connections to pave her way in the industry. Within 2 years, Serafina was everywhere. I watched her on TV as she became the youngest actress to ever win the grand jury prize. The day she was set to return, my hands were shaking with excitement. But that was the same day the truth about my birth came out. I wasn't a Prescott. I was the son of a pair of day laborers, switched at birth with the true heir by someone who had slipped past the nurses. The day the real son, Owen Prescott, was brought to the estate, my adoptive mother held my hand. "Even with Owen here, you will always be a son of this family." My sister ruffled my hair, her smile unchanged. "What's one more person? The Prescotts aren't so poor we can't afford to feed another mouth." Serafina even canceled a shoot and flew back overnight. She held me tight and swore, "I can protect you now. Even if the Prescotts don't want you, I will." The knot of fear in my chest slowly loosened. Out of guilt, I started putting Owen first in everything. I helped him with his studies, taught him etiquette, let him have first choice of everything. Terrified he would feel out of place, he in turn followed me everywhere, calling me brother. I was truly happy then. I thought I was the luckiest person in the world, blessed with such a wonderful family and a love like ours. Eventually, Owen started tagging along on my dates with Serafina. At first she complained about the third wheel. Owen would fire back that he was just making sure her intentions were pure. I mediated between them, and they reached a tense truce, slowly without me noticing when it started. Serafina began to remember Owen's favorite things, to understand his moods, even to remember his birthday. And Owen would casually ask me questions about Serafina's childhood. Looking back, I can trace the exact shape of how much I loved him, which is part of what made losing him so much harder to survive than losing almost anything else that year. I taught Owen to drive on the long private road behind the estate. Both of us laughing so hard the first time, he stalled the car that my father came out to see what the commotion was. I stayed up with him, the night before his university entrance exams, quizzing him on material neither of us fully understood, because he was too anxious to sleep and I couldn't stand the idea of him facing that morning alone. When kids at his new school made comments about him being the real Prescott who'd had to fight his way back into his own family, he came to me first, not our parents, and I remember feeling, in that moment, like the older brother I'd never actually had the chance to be for anyone. I built an entire identity around being the person who made his transition easier. It never once occurred to me that he might eventually decide easing his own way meant taking something of mine. It all came to a head during a trip to the mountains when a sudden rock slide sent boulders tumbling down the slope. I watched, frozen, as Serafina grabbed Owen's hand and pulled him to safety. I managed to scramble out of the way, but not before a rock gashed my leg open. "In the hospital," she explained through tears. "I'm so sorry, Noah." In that moment, I thought Owen was you. I said nothing, but my heart felt like it had been plunged into ice. Something was spinning horribly out of my control. The day I was discharged, I went home early. I even bought a bouquet of roses on the way, planning to surprise her. But there, under the rose wall in the garden, I saw something that shattered me. Serafina was standing very close to Owen, her arms around his neck. The way she looked at him was the way she used to look, only at me. I stood rooted to the spot, feeling as if I'd walked into a nightmare. The sharp pain of the rose thorns digging into my palm was too real to deny. I rushed forward, my voice cracking as I shouted at them. Rose petals scattered around us. I demanded an explanation, my whole body shaking. Serafina didn't even flinch. She stepped in front of Owen and said coldly, "He's your brother. What gives you the right to speak to him like that? Look at yourself, Noah. You're out of control." Owen stepped up beside her, his face a mask of regret. "I'm sorry, brother, but Sarah and I have feelings for each other. If we had never been switched, I would have been the one to meet her first." Then he intertwined his fingers with hers, his eyes meeting mine, full of defiance. "I apologize. You can be angry with me, you can yell at me, but I will not give her up." The last thread of my sanity snapped. I grabbed a nearby potted plant and hurled it to the ground, screaming. Everything that had built up inside me, the betrayal, the pain, the years of trust thrown away. Serafina just pulled Owen further away, her expression one of disgust. "You really need to see a doctor." My parents and sister came running at the sound of the crash. They saw me disheveled and covered in dirt, and their brows knitted in disapproval. "Noah, that's enough. Owen is your brother. Can't you just let him have this?" They stood together, a united front, their faces identical, masks of cold disdain, and I stood opposite them, looking like a wild animal. In that moment, all the little oddities, all the strange moments from the past few months clicked into place. But I wasn't ready to give up. I found out where Serafina was filming and went to the studio, demanding answers. She stood at a distance, watching with contempt as her bodyguards held me back. "Don't ever come near me again," she said. "And if you spread any more rumors about Owen, you'll regret it." Rage and desperation consumed me. I went to the tabloids. I told them everything. Serafina's affair, Owen knowingly becoming the other man. I plastered the story everywhere I could, determined to ruin them. I wanted the world to know that the beloved actress I had helped create was nothing but a backstabbing traitor. But the Prescott family crushed the story. I fought them, yelled, broke things around the house. And in a moment of complete despair, I said I couldn't go on like this. All I got for my efforts was a stinging slap from my sister. "Noah, have you made enough of a scene?" she'd said, her voice dripping with ice. "You stole Owen's life. All of this should have been his from the start. We raised you for 20 years. This is how you repay us. You can't tame a stray." They confined me to my room. Days blurred into one another in silence, with only a simple meal left outside the door each day. I barely saw anyone. The loneliness was a swamp slowly drowning me. I don't know how long I was in there before the door finally opened. Serafina stood silhouetted against the light. "Our promise still stands," she said. "I will marry you, Noel." They let me out, and a wedding was hastily arranged. I wasn't naive enough to think it was because they'd had a change of heart. The Prescott family was powerful, but not invincible. My public breakdown, though mostly suppressed, had still made ripples. If Serafina were to marry anyone but me, it would only confirm the crazy stories I had told. The day before the wedding, my adoptive mother spoke to me in the living room. "Now that you've come to your senses, don't cause any trouble tomorrow. Owen has been very unstable lately. I want you to go and apologize to him today." My sister swirled the red wine in her glass. "Noah, everything you have was given to you by this family. Behave, and we might let you keep some of your dignity. You know what to say and what not to say tomorrow." It was all so absurd, I didn't even have the energy to laugh. Seeing my silence, Serafina's face darkened. "I'm marrying you, Noah. What more could you possibly want? If anyone should be complaining, it's not you. You're the one who stole someone else's life. Don't be ungrateful, brother. It's all my fault." Owen started, stepping toward me. "Get away from me," I snarled, stepping back sharply. My family's expressions turned thunderous. "Noah, what do you think you're doing? Apologize to Owen now." I looked at the four of them, lined up like a jury that had already reached its verdict, and I understood, finally, that there was nothing left to say that any of them would actually hear. So I said the only thing that felt true. "No." The word landed in that room like a dropped glass. My sister's wine sloshed over the rim as her hand tightened. My mother's mouth pressed into a thin white line. My father, who had said almost nothing this entire time, finally spoke, quiet and final, the way he always was right before he made a decision that couldn't be undone. "Noah, tomorrow you will stand at that altar, you will say your vows, and you will smile for the cameras, because the Prescott name does not survive a scandal. After that, what you do with your evenings is your business, but you will not embarrass this family in public again." I laughed. Then, a short, broken sound that surprised even me. "You're not asking me to marry her," I said. "You're asking me to perform being married to her while she's in love with your actual son." No one answered, because there was no answer that didn't confirm it. I married Serafina the next afternoon in a private ceremony attended by exactly 11 people, none of whom, I would learn later, believed for a second that it was anything but damage control. She wore white. I wore the suit my sister had picked out for me, tailored so precisely it felt like a costume for someone else's life. When the officiant asked if I took Serafina to be my wife, I said yes, because refusing would have cost more than saying it. When Serafina said yes in return, she didn't look at me. She looked past my shoulder, to where Owen stood among the small crowd of guests, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on her, like a man watching something be taken from him in slow motion. I understood, in that moment, that I wasn't the groom at my own wedding. I was the obstacle standing between two people who had already decided, quietly, that they belonged together. I just hadn't been informed of my role yet. For 3 months after the wedding, we lived like strangers sharing a house that used to feel like home. Serafina worked constantly, flying between sets, and when she was home, Owen was rarely far behind, and to the guise of family closeness no one questioned anymore. I threw myself into the one thing that still made sense to me, the kitchen. My adoptive mother had never let me near it growing up, said it wasn't proper for a Prescott heir, but somewhere in those quiet, humiliating months, cooking became the only hour of the day I didn't feel like a ghost. An old housekeeper named Mrs. Alves The only person in that house who'd ever treated me like a person instead of a liability. Taught me knife work in the early mornings before anyone else woke up. She used to say, "Noah, a kitchen doesn't care whose name is on the deed. It only cares whether you show up and do the work." I didn't know yet how much I'd come to live by that. There were nights during those 3 months I still, shamefully, tried to reach her. I'd leave a plate of something warm by her side of the bed on nights she came home late from a shoot, telling myself it was habit, not hope, though it was obviously both. Once, she actually ate it, sitting on the edge of the mattress in her stage makeup at 2 in the morning, and for one strange, suspended half hour, we talked the way we used to, about nothing important, and I let myself believe, against every piece of evidence in front of me, that whatever had broken between us might still be salvageable. The next morning she was gone before I woke. A note on the counter saying she and Owen had an early flight for a location scout neither of them had mentioned the night before. I threw the leftover plate away without eating anything myself. I didn't try again after that. Mrs. Alves noticed, of course. She noticed everything. She started leaving me a second plate at the small table off the kitchen most evenings, no explanation offered, none needed. We ate together in near silence most nights, the two of us, the only honest hour of most of my days. It was around then that she started teaching me things beyond simple knife work, how to read a room of diners, the way she'd learned to read a room of Prescott's, how to know, from the set of someone's shoulders, whether a dish had actually satisfied them, or merely fed them. I didn't know it yet, but she was teaching me the exact skill that would keep a small diner in a town called Milbrook afloat through its hardest first winter, years before either of us had any reason to imagine that diner existing at all. There was a gala that autumn, the annual Prescott Corporation benefit, the kind of event I'd once loved as a teenager, sneaking extra desserts off the catering trays with Isabel while our parents worked the room. As a married man with no real marriage, I hated every second of it. Serafina arrived on Owen's arm, technically because I was running late from the kitchen, though I noticed neither of them seemed to mind the extra minutes alone. My mother pulled me aside near the bar and told me, in the particular tone she used when she wanted something to sound like advice instead of an order, that appearances mattered more than feelings. That a marriage was a structure you maintained whether or not you happened to love the person inside it. I asked her, plainly, if that was the marriage she and my father had. She didn't answer. She just smoothed the front of my jacket and walked back into the crowd. Later that night, I found Mrs. Alves alone in the kitchen, polishing silver long after the last course had gone out. She'd worked for the Prescotts for over 30 years, long enough to have watched 3 generations perform this exact kind of loyalty, for cameras and creditors alike. "Noah," she said, not looking up from the fork in her hand, "you should leave this house. Not tonight, but soon." I asked her why, though some small, stubborn part of me already knew the answer. "Because I've seen this family decide someone is expendable before," she said quietly. "It never ends the way the expendable one hopes it will." I laughed it off at the time, told her I had nowhere else to go, that whatever was happening between Serafina and Owen would burn itself out the way these things always did. Mrs. Alves just shook her head and went back to the silver, and I have thought about that conversation more times in the years since than almost any other conversation of my life. 2 weeks later, I came home early from an errand to find my sister and Serafina huddled over documents at the dining room table, voices low, papers that disappeared into a folder the moment I walked in. When I asked what it was, Isabel said, without missing a beat, "Just some contract work for the foundation, nothing that concerns you." I believed her, because believing her was easier than sitting with the alternative, that whatever they were planning, it already had my name written somewhere inside it. I understand now, looking back, that the frame was being built for weeks before that fountain ever cracked Owen's skull. The potted plant I'd smashed in the garden months earlier wasn't an isolated moment of grief they happened to witness. It was the first exhibit in a case file that had already been opened. The end came on a Tuesday in October, the kind of ordinary day that gives no warning it's about to break your life in half. Owen came to find me in the garden, agitated, pale, saying he needed to talk, that things had gotten out of control, that Serafina was threatening to leave the family entirely and take him with her, that our parents were furious, that everything was unraveling and it was somehow, impossibly, my fault for existing at all. I told him I had nothing left to give him. I told him, for the first time in years, exactly what I thought of him, that he'd taken the one thing I loved simply because he could, because he'd never once had to want something he wasn't handed. He went quiet. Then he grabbed my arm, hard enough to bruise, saying I owed him an apology, that I'd ruined his relationship with our parents by making a scene, that I needed to fix it. I pulled away. He stumbled backward into the edge of the stone fountain, cracking his head against the rim hard enough to draw blood. I remember the sound before I remember the sight of it, a wet, awful crack. And then Owen on the ground, blood running into the water, and then screaming, though it took me a moment to realize the screaming was Serafina's, because she was already there, already running toward him, already looking at me like I was something monstrous. I hadn't touched him. I hadn't laid a single hand on him, beyond pulling my own arm free. But by the time security arrived, by the time my sister arrived, by the time the story had been told, and rattled in the space of 10 frantic minutes, it had become something else entirely. Noah attacked Owen. Noah has been unstable for months. Noah has a documented history of violent outbursts, a history that existed, conveniently, because months earlier I'd smashed a potted plant, in front of witnesses my family had cultivated for exactly this purpose. I didn't understand, standing there in the garden with Owen's blood still on the fountain's edge, that I wasn't watching an accident being misread. I was watching a plan I hadn't known existed finally executing itself. The police were called, not by Owen, who was conscious within minutes and strangely, tellingly quiet through the whole process, not by my parents, who stood back and let it happen with expressions of grave, rehearsed sorrow. It was Serafina who called them, Serafina, who gave the statement, Serafina who stood in front of the house that evening and told a small cluster of reporters, tears streaming with camera-ready precision, that her husband had a history of instability, that the family had tried, quietly, for months, to manage and protect him from himself, and that they were devastated it had come to this. I was arrested that night. I spent 11 months in pretrial detention before the case against me, built on Owen's testimony, a doctored medical report, and the testimony of 2 staff members my sister had quietly compensated, resulted in a conviction. Assault. 18 months, most of which I'd already served by the time sentencing came down. My court-appointed lawyer, overworked and unconvinced by my version of events, that no one had bothered to actually investigate, told me my best option was to plead down, and take the shorter sentence. I did. I didn't have the strength left to fight. No one from the Prescott family visited me. Not once. 3 weeks after I was sentenced, Serafina held a press conference. I watched it on a small television, bolted to the wall of the common room, surrounded by men, who had no idea who I was. She wore black. She said that the stress of everything, the scandal, the trial, the family's fracture, had become too much for someone she still, despite everything, cared for deeply, and that Noah had taken his own life, in his cell 3 days earlier. She said it with tears that looked, even through a television screen, completely real. I sat there, very much alive, and watched my own wife announce my death to the entire country. I understood, finally and completely, what I actually was to them. Not a son, not a husband. A loose end, tied it away. The first week in the county facility, before I was transferred to serve the remainder of my sentence. A man twice, my size decided I looked like an easy target, the kind of soft, moneyed face that hadn't earned its place yet. He cornered me near the showers on my 3rd night, said something about my watch, my clothes, the particular way I still flinched at loud noises like someone who'd never actually had to survive anything. I didn't fight back. I'd spent my whole life being told I was lucky to be there, lucky to be included, and some old, exhausted part of me had simply stopped believing I deserved to defend myself. An older inmate named Marcus Webb pulled the man off me, before it went further, not out of kindness exactly, more out of a weary, practical sense that a fight in the showers brought guards, and guards brought trouble for everyone. He looked at me afterward, still bleeding a little from the lip, and said, "You gotta decide, kid, whether you're gonna survive this or just wait for someone else to survive it for you. No boat is coming. I want you to understand that now, so you stop wasting energy hoping otherwise." I didn't understand yet how right he was. Marcus became, in his own gruff way, the second person inside those walls who taught me something I actually needed. He'd been sentenced 14 years earlier for a robbery he swore, calmly and without much apparent bitterness, he hadn't committed. Wrong place, wrong face, a public defender who'd met him twice before the trial. I didn't know, then, whether to believe him. I know now that it didn't matter either way, because what he taught me wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was about how to disappear into the rhythm of a place that wanted to erase you, and come out the other side still recognizably yourself. Keep your head down. Keep your hands busy. Don't explain yourself to people who've already decided who you are. I carried that with me long after I walked out the gates. My first parole hearing, 8 months into the sentence proper, went nowhere. The board cited the severity of the original charge, and a victim impact statement, written, I later learned, entirely by my sister. though signed with Owen's name, describing an ongoing pattern of instability and threats that had never actually happened. I sat in that hearing room and listened to a version of myself I didn't recognize be used as the reason to keep me exactly where they wanted me. I didn't apply again for another 10 months. I told myself it was because I didn't want to face that room a second time. The truth was closer to this. Some nights, in that first year, I genuinely wondered whether the version of me that existed outside those walls still existed at all, or whether Serafina's press conference had made it true in every way that mattered. It was Desmond, more than the culinary program itself, who talked me back from that particular ledge. He'd lost people to it before, he told me once, guys who came in angry and came out numb, mistaking numbness for healing because it hurt less in the moment. You're allowed to be furious, Noah, he said. You're just not allowed to let the fury be the only thing you build with. Build something else instead. Build it quiet, build it slow, and build it so well that when you finally walk out that door, nobody who wronged you gets to touch it. That sentence sat with me longer than almost anything anyone had said to me in the 8 years since my second parole hearing. 18 months after the first, went differently, though not because anyone in that room had grown any fonder of me. By then Desmond's program had a name in the facility as something that actually worked, and the warden herself spoke on my behalf, citing a discipline record with nothing on it, 400 hours of culinary instruction, and what she called, dryly, an unusually quiet presence for a man the file insisted was violent. Marcus, ineligible himself for another 6 years, shook my hand at the gate the day I finally left, and told me, "Don't come back to visit. Don't be sentimental about this place. Just go build the thing." I promised him I would. I kept that promise, eventually, in a way neither of us could have predicted that morning. I found out later that the story had done exactly what it was designed to do. It ended the scandal. Reporters stopped asking questions about the assault charge the moment there was a tragedy to mourn instead of a mystery to investigate. My name was quietly scrubbed from the family's public history. Isabel gave one interview, months later, referring to me only as a troubled young man the family had tried and failed to help. Owen, recovered and rehabilitated in the public eye, became the sole heir once more, this time with no complicated brother to explain away. Serafina's career, if anything, benefited. The grieving widow narrative bought her a wave of public sympathy that carried her into her next 3 films. I served the remainder of my sentence in a medium security facility 300 miles from anyone who'd ever known me as Noah Prescott. I didn't correct anyone who assumed I had no family to speak of. It was easier that way. The kitchen was the only place in that facility where time moved at a pace I could survive. I worked my way into the prison's small culinary program, run by a man named Desmond Reyes, a former line cook who'd done a decade himself years earlier, and came back, once he was out, to teach. Said he owed the profession a debt for keeping him sane inside. He didn't ask about my case. He just handed me a knife and told me to prove I could hold it properly. Over the following months, he taught me things no Prescott dinner table ever had: how to break down a whole animal, how to build a stock from nothing but bones and patience, how food, cooked with attention, could be its own kind of honesty, in a life that had otherwise been built entirely out of performance. Desmond used to say, "The plate doesn't lie to you, kid. Everything else in this world will. The plate won't." I believed him. I still do. It was Desmond, in my last month inside, who told me something that would end up changing everything. He'd tracked down, out of some quiet, honest for kindness, the couple who'd raised me for the first 6 days of my life before the switch at the hospital, my biological parents, Frank and Dolores Kessler, day laborers who'd spent 30 years believing their son had died shortly after birth, never knowing the truth the Prescotts had buried. They were gone by the time Desmond found the trail. Frank first, then Dolores 2 years later, but they'd left behind a small parcel of land, in a nowhere town called Milbrook, inherited through Dolores' family for 3 generations, worthless dirt as far as anyone had ever cared, until a regional food distributor had approached the estate lawyer 18 months earlier wanting to lease the land for a processing facility, sitting as it did on a rail line nobody had thought twice about in 50 years. By the time I was released, that worthless parcel of land was quietly generating more in annual lease income than most people saw in a decade. It wasn't a fortune, but it was mine, entirely, untouched by the Prescott name, and it was enough, combined with everything Desmond had taught me, to open a diner in a town no one from my old life would ever think to look. Before any of that, though, I made a trip I hadn't planned on making, out to the small township, where Frank and Dolores Kessler had spent the whole of their working lives, 3 hours from anywhere that mattered on a map, to see, with my own eyes, whatever was left of the people whose blood I actually carried. Their old neighbor, a woman named Ruth Petricus who'd lived next door to the Kesslers for over 20 years. Invited me in for coffee the moment I explained who I was, studying my face the whole time like she was looking for pieces of two people she'd cared about and the features of a stranger. Dolores used to say she had a boy out there somewhere, Ruth told me, hands wrapped around her mug. Everybody figured it was grief talking. Turns out she just knew something the rest of us didn't have the sense to believe. She showed me photographs. Frank, broad-shouldered and squinting into the sun on a job site. Dolores, younger than I'd pictured, laughing at something outside the frame. They kept a garden most of the town thought was too ambitious for the soil out there, Ruth said. Grew tomatoes nobody else could manage in this dirt. Stubborn people. I think you'd have liked them. I sat in that woman's kitchen for 3 hours, learning the shape of two lives I'd never gotten to be part of, and left with a box of photographs and a single, quiet certainty I hadn't expected to find out there, that whatever I built next wasn't going to be built to prove anything to the Prescotts. It was going to be built for two people who'd spent 30 years grieving a son they never got to raise, and it was going to be worth showing up for, whether or not they'd ever get to see it. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't fast. The first building I leased in Milbrook had a roof that failed within a month of signing, eating most of what little capital I'd started with. I spent 6 weeks patching it myself, evenings and weekends, because I couldn't afford a contractor and wouldn't ask the Kessler Estate's lawyer for an advance on money that still felt, somehow, like it belonged to people I'd never gotten to thank. The town was polite but distant in the way small towns often are with newcomers. A few regulars trickled in that first winter, mostly out of curiosity, mostly because there was nowhere else nearby to get a hot meal, after the diesel plant let out at 6. I remember standing behind that counter some nights with exactly one customer in the whole place, wondering whether Desmond's lessons and Marcus' warnings, and everything I'd survived to get there had led me to a slow, quiet way of failing instead of a fast one. What changed it wasn't luck exactly, though it felt that way at the time. A trucker passing through on the interstate detour stopped in one January night during a snowstorm that had closed the highway for 6 hours, ate a bowl of the short rib stew I'd been perfecting for months, and posted about it online before he'd even finished the bowl. It wasn't much, a handful of comments, a few strangers driving 30 minutes out of their way the following weekend just to see what the fuss was about. But it was the first sign, in over a year of quiet, patient work, that something I'd built entirely on my own terms might actually be worth something to somebody. I didn't chase it after that. I just kept cooking the way Desmond taught me, one plate at a time, and let the rest take however long it needed to. I named it nothing clever, just the Kessler, after the parents I'd never gotten to know, and the only tribute I knew how to pay them. I found Gidgey 18 months later, half frozen outside the diner's back door on a night not unlike the one I'd found Serafina on, years earlier, a runaway, 15 years old, red-dyed hair, and a black eye she wouldn't explain, flinching at every raised voice. I recognized something in her I understood too well, the particular, wary stillness of someone who'd learned that being noticed usually meant being hurt. I didn't fall in love with her, the way I once had with Serafina. I just fed her, gave her the spare room above the diner, and told her the door was never locked if she needed to leave, and it was never locked if she needed to come back. She stayed. 2 years later, she still called me Noah instead of anything more formal, and I never asked her to change that, because somewhere in that arrangement, without either of us naming it out loud, we'd built the first family either of us had ever actually chosen. It wasn't immediate, that trust. For the first few months, Gidgey barely spoke to me beyond what was necessary, ate her meals standing at the counter facing the door like she was ready to leave the second something felt wrong, and flinched hard. The one time I raised my voice at a delivery driver who'd shorted an order, I learned, slowly and mostly by accident, pieces of where she'd come from, a father who drank, a mother who'd chosen him over her more times than Gidgey could count, a system that had shuffled her through to foster placements before she decided the road was safer than either of them. I never pushed for more than she offered. Just kept leaving food on the counter and kept the door unlocked, the way I'd promised, and let the trust build at whatever pace it needed to build. The closest we came to losing that fragile new life together was about 8 months in, when a man matching her father's description started asking around town about a girl with red-streaked hair. Gidgey went white the moment she heard, packed a bag in 11 minutes, and told me, flatly, that she'd be gone by morning so I wouldn't have to get involved. I told her, just as flatly, that I wasn't asking what she wanted to do. I was telling her what I intended to do, which was stand between her and that man for exactly as long as she needed me to. I called the sheriff, a woman named Deb Ruiz who'd become one of my steadiest regulars over the past year, and between the two of us, We made it very clear that Milbrook wasn't a town where that man was welcome to linger. He left 3 days later. Gidgee didn't. And something in the way she looked at me after that, not gratitude exactly, something quieter and more permanent than gratitude, told me the family we'd been building without naming it had just become something neither of us would walk away from easily. I built a life, slowly, deliberately, out of things that were entirely mine. The diner became known, in a small regional way, for food that was better than a town like Milbrook had any right to expect. A food writer passing through wrote a single paragraph about it, in a regional magazine, calling it the best plate of shrimp scampi she'd had outside a city kitchen. I didn't chase the attention. I let it come and go, because I'd learned, the hard way, that being seen wasn't always safe. What I didn't let anyone see was the other half of what Desmond's lesson had grown into, a small, quiet consulting practice I ran under a different name entirely, Julian Frost, helping struggling regional restaurants fix broken kitchens and failing menus for a fee that, over 6 years, had made me considerably wealthier than anyone in Milbrook would have guessed, looking at the man who still wiped down his own counters every night. I never told Gidgee the full scope of it. I never told anyone. It wasn't about hiding money. It was about making sure that if anyone ever came looking for me again, they'd find exactly what I wanted them to find. A quiet man with a small diner, nothing worth the trouble of taking. The Julian Frost work started almost by accident. A regional chain 2 counties over, a family-run steakhouse called Howren's, was 3 months from closing when the owner, a stubborn, exhausted man named Pat Halloran, came into the diner one slow Tuesday and, over a plate of shrimp scampi, admitted he had no idea how to fix what was broken. I gave him a few suggestions I didn't think much of at the time. Cut the menu by half, fix the walk-ins temperature logs, stop buying produce from a distributor who was quietly overcharging him. 3 months later, Howren's turned its first profitable quarter in 6 years. Pat told 2 other owners. Those owners told others. Within 18 months, Julian Frost, a name I'd pulled at random off an old road sign the day I filed the paperwork, had a small, quiet reputation of his own across 4 counties, one that never once crossed paths with anyone who might recognize the man behind it. I kept the 2 lives scrupulously separate. Noah ran a diner in Milbrook and never turned down a shift. Julian answered emails late at night after closing, took no meetings in person if he could help it, and existed, as far as anyone outside a small circle of grateful restaurant owners knew, as a name on an invoice and nothing more. It was, I told myself, simply good business sense. It took me longer than it should have to admit it was also the last, quiet piece of armor I hadn't been ready to put down. Which brings me back to the day Serafina and Isabel walked through my door for the first time in 8 years, clutching a medical report and a watch meant for the brother who'd once put me in prison. They came back 3 more times that week. I served them the same way I served everyone, polite, distant, entirely unbothered, and each time, I watched something in Isabel's composure crack a little further. On the 4th visit, she came alone, waiting until the diner emptied out near closing before she finally spoke. "Noah, I need to tell you something, and I need you to actually listen." I kept wiping down the counter. "I'm listening." She hesitated longer than I'd ever seen her hesitate about anything. "Owen isn't just recovering from an injury. He's dying, Noah. Kidney failure. He's been on a transplant list for 8 months and there's nothing compatible coming. The doctors gave him maybe a year, if he's careful." I set the rag down. "And you're telling me this because I had blood work done on all of us, 6 months ago," quietly, "when the doctor said family donors were our best option." Her voice shook. "You're a match, Noah. A perfect match. Better than mine, better than Mom's." I stood there in the low light of a diner built on land that belonged to parents I'd never gotten to meet, being asked to save the life of the brother who'd taken everything I'd ever had, and I felt, for the first time in 8 years, something close to the old fury rising in my chest, not because of the ask itself, but because of the sheer, breathtaking audacity of walking back into my life to make it. "I'm not doing that," I said quietly, "and I'd like you to leave now." Isabel's composure finally broke completely. "Noah, please. He's your brother." "He was never my brother," I said. "You made that very clear. 8 years ago, in your own living room. You told me everything I had was given to me by your family, and that I should behave, and keep my dignity. I did neither, and I've never regretted it once." "Isabel, you don't get to decide, now that it's convenient, which parts of that were true." She left without another word. I didn't sleep much that night. 3 days after that, a lawyer I'd never met showed up at the diner during the lunch rush, waited politely until the counter cleared, and introduced herself as outside counsel for the Prescott family. She didn't threaten me outright. People like her rarely do it that plainly. She talked instead about the value of family harmony, about how certain old records, sealed as part of my plea agreement 8 years earlier, could in theory be reopened if anyone decided to revisit the terms of that arrangement, about how a man with a diner, a young ward, and a quiet second business had quite a lot, really, that a prolonged legal dispute could put at risk. I let her finish. Then I told her, as evenly as I could manage, that I'd spent 8 years being told what I stood to lose if I didn't behave, and I'd already lost everything that threat had ever meant to protect. She left without her coffee. I didn't touch the tip jar for a week, half expecting to matter somehow, the way small superstitions sometimes fill in for control you don't actually have. 2 weeks after that, a photograph surfaced online, grainy, taken from across the street, of Serafina and Isabel standing outside a diner in a town nobody outside Milbrook had ever had reason to photograph. A tabloid ran 3 sentences speculating about a secret Prescott family retreat. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make my hands shake behind the counter that night, enough to remind me that the quiet, careful anonymity I'd built for 6 years was never as permanent as I'd let myself believe. Gigi found me staring at my phone after close and asked, carefully, if everything was okay. I told her the truth, finally, all of it, the whole 8 years, sitting across from her at the same counter, where I'd first fed her a bowl of shrimp scampi, without asking a single question in return. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she reached over and put her hand flat on the counter between us. Whatever happens next, she said, you're not doing it alone this time. I believed her more than I'd believed almost anything in 8 years. 2 days later, Serafina came alone, and for the first time in 8 years, she didn't perform anything. She sat at the counter, ordered nothing, and simply said, I know what I did to you. I've known for years. I told myself it was the only way to protect what was left of my career, and then I told myself it was the only way to protect Owen, and eventually I stopped telling myself anything at all, because the truth was easier to ignore than to face. I looked at her, really looked, for the first time since she'd walked back into my life, and saw, underneath the practiced stillness, the cameras had trained into her, someone who looked almost as tired as I'd felt in that prison common room, watching my own funeral announced on a bolted-down television. I don't need your confession, Serafina, I said. I needed it 8 years ago. Now I just need you to understand that it changes nothing. Her eyes filled, but she didn't look away. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to save him anyway, because whatever he did, whatever I did, none of it was ever his fault the way it was ours. He didn't orchestrate the accusation. Your family did. I didn't orchestrate the funeral announcement. I did that, alone. Because it was easier than telling the truth. Owen has spent 8 years thinking you actually did what they said. He doesn't know, Noah. He still doesn't know the full truth of what was done to you. If you let him die without ever knowing that, I don't think I could live with what that makes all of us. That, more than anything Isabel had said, stayed with me. Not guilt for Owen. I still felt none of that, and I wasn't sure I ever would, again, but a different kind of pull entirely, the pull of finally, after 8 years, being able to make the truth impossible to bury a second time. I didn't agree to the transplant that week, or the week after. Instead, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called a number I hadn't used in 6 years, the private line of the one journalist who'd tried, briefly, back when the case first broke, to ask questions no one else had wanted answered. A woman named Priya Okafor who'd been quietly blacklisted from 3 major outlets, for pushing too hard on a story the Prescott family's lawyers had made very expensive to publish. I told her everything, the switch at birth, the affair, the staged accident, the manufactured assault charge, the funeral announcement given to a man who was very much alive. I gave her Desmond's contact information, the old prison records, copies of medical reports Isabel herself had unknowingly confirmed existed. I gave her 8 years of silence, finally spoken out loud. Priya didn't run with it immediately. She spent 6 weeks verifying every piece of it, the way I'd have wanted her to if I'd had any say in the matter. She drove out to the medium security facility, and requested my old records through channels the Prescott family's lawyers hadn't thought to seal. She found that 2 staff members who'd testified against me at trial, one had since left the family's employ entirely and, faced with a journalist who already knew most of the truth, finally admitted she'd been offered a settlement in exchange for her original statement. The other refused to talk, which Priya told me, dryly, was its own kind of confirmation. She tracked down Desmond, retired by then, but sharp as ever, who corroborated the timeline of my sentence and release without hesitation, and who told her, and prompted, that in 14 years of running that culinary program, he'd never taught a student who deserved it less than I did and needed it more. Midway through her reporting, the Prescott family's legal team found out what she was working on and offered her, through channels just oblique enough to be deniable, a considerable sum of money to simply let the story go. She called me the night she turned it down, furious in a way I hadn't seen from her before, and told me she'd been a journalist for 11 years specifically because stories like this one were the reason she'd chosen the job at all. I asked her if she was scared of what it might cost her. A little, she admitted, but not as scared as I'd be if I let them buy it back. I understood, listening to her, that I wasn't the only person whose life had quietly reshaped itself around the shape of this particular injustice. The story broke on a Thursday. By Friday morning, it was the only thing anyone in the country was talking about. Prescott Corporation's stock dropped 11% in a single session. Serafina's studio quietly shelved the release of her next film pending. In their words, further review. My parents, the people who'd raised me for 20 years and discarded me in under 20 minutes, gave no public statement, though prior follow-up reporting found that my father had resigned from 2 of his board positions within the month, citing health reasons no one believed. Serafina's downfall, when it came, was slower, and somehow crueler than any single headline could capture. The premiere for the film she'd shot the year my funeral was announced was postponed indefinitely the week the story broke, the studio citing scheduling conflicts nobody believed either. A late-night interview she'd already committed to went forward anyway, and the clip that circulated afterward wasn't of anything she'd actually said in her own defense. It was 6 seconds of dead air after the host asked, gently but directly, whether she had anything she wanted to say to the man she'd once told the country had taken his own life. 6 seconds of a woman who, for the first time, in a decade of practiced composure, had absolutely nothing rehearsed to offer. It played on a loop for a week. I didn't watch it more than once. It didn't feel like vindication I might have expected, years earlier, to feel. It just felt like watching someone finally run out of road. I didn't do any of it for the money, though the settlement that eventually came, once the family's lawyers realized a defamation and wrongful imprisonment suit was unwinnable any other way, was more than even Julian Frost's quiet consulting had earned me in 6 years combined. I did it because I was done being the version of this story that other people got to write. Owen came to the diner himself, 3 weeks later, thinner than I remembered, moving carefully, like a man who understood, finally, exactly how fragile he actually was. He sat at the same counter Serafina had sat at, and for a long time he didn't say anything at all. I'm not going to ask you for anything, he finally said. I don't think I have the right to. I just needed you to know that I didn't understand, back then, what was actually happening. I thought I was falling in love. I didn't understand I was being handed someone else's life, and told it was mine to keep. I wiped down a glass I didn't need to wipe down. That doesn't undo it, Owen. I know, he said quietly. I'm not asking it to. I never gave him the transplant. Not out of cruelty, in the end, but because 3 days after that conversation, a compatible donor was finally found through the registry, an actual stranger, someone with no history, no debt to repay, no old wound to reopen. Owen survived. I heard, eventually, that the surgery went well, that he'd stepped back from any real involvement in Prescott Corporation, that he and Serafina had quietly ended things sometime in the chaos that followed the story breaking. 2 people who'd built an entire relationship on the wreckage of someone else's life, finally realizing they had nothing left to stand on together. The lawsuit, when it finally came, moved faster than anyone on either side expected. My attorney, a sharp, unflappable woman named Corinne Vasquez who'd taken the case pro bono the week the story broke, told me plainly that most cases like mine took years, but that the Prescott family's board, already reeling from an 11% stock drop and a press cycle that showed no sign of slowing, wanted this settled and buried long before it reached an actual courtroom. It nearly did anyway. I sat for 1 full day of deposition, answering questions from a Prescott family attorney who tried, and successfully, to suggest that my own outburst 8 years earlier had somehow justified everything that followed. Corinne let him finish, then asked one simple question of her own, whether he could produce a single piece of evidence, anywhere in 8 years of family records, that I had ever laid a hand on Owen Prescott. He couldn't. The room went quiet the same way that dining room had gone quiet the night before my wedding, except this time, I was the one who finally had nothing left to prove. The settlement, when it came 3 weeks later, included a public statement from Prescott Corporation acknowledging, in careful legal language, that the original allegations against me had not been substantiated, and that the company regretted the harm caused by its handling of the matter. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was signed by my father, and it was the closest to an admission I, would ever get from him. Isabel's boardroom didn't survive the fallout as gracefully. A minority shareholder group, circling for years for exactly this kind of opening, called an emergency vote 8 months after the story broke, citing the settlement's cost and the reputational damage as evidence of a governance failure at the highest level. I wasn't in the room the day it happened, though Priya was, covering it for a different outlet by then, and she told me afterward that Isabel had stood at that podium and taken the vote without a single word of self-defense, like someone who'd already, quietly, made peace with losing. Desmond Cade, ironically, was one of the board members who voted her out. The same skepticism he'd once aimed at me turned finally on the family he'd spent 2 decades protecting. Owen's transplant surgery happened on a Tuesday in March, a detail I only know because Serafina texted me that morning and prompted, just to say it was happening, in case I wanted to know. I didn't go to the hospital. I wasn't ready for that, and I'm not sure I ever will be entirely. But I sat in the diner that whole afternoon, between the lunch and dinner rush, checking my phone more than I wanted to admit, and when Serafina texted again that evening, "He's out of surgery. He's going to be okay," I found that some old, stubborn corner of myself that I'd assumed had gone numb to anything involving Owen felt something that was, unmistakably, relief. I didn't examine it too closely. Some things are easier left exactly as complicated as they actually are. Isabel resigned as CEO 18 months later, in the middle of a shareholder revolt she never fully recovered from. I didn't celebrate it. I didn't need to. I'd stopped needing their downfall to feel like my own life had finally started counting for something. I still run the diner. Gigi is 19 now, studying culinary science 2 towns over, coming home most weekends whether I ask her to or not. Priya still calls sometimes, mostly just to check in, though somewhere in the 18 months of talking through my case with her, checking in had quietly become something else entirely, something neither of us had planned for and both of us, eventually, stopped pretending not to want. She doesn't care about the Kessler land, or Julian Frost's consulting fees, or any version of my name that isn't the one I use for her. She likes the shrimp scampi. She thinks the coffee is terrible, and tells me so every single time. My mother came to the diner once, alone, about a year after the story broke. She sat at the counter for nearly 20 minutes before she said anything, and when she finally spoke, it wasn't an apology, exactly. I'm not sure my mother has ever fully apologized for anything in her life. It was closer to an accounting. I told myself for 20 years that loving Owen enough meant I had to love you less, as though there wasn't enough of it to go around. I don't know when I started believing that, or why I never questioned it until there was nothing left to question it with. I didn't tell her it was fine, because it wasn't, and I've stopped pretending things are fine simply because saying so is easier than sitting with the truth. I told her I appreciated her coming, and that I hoped she found whatever peace she was looking for, and that I didn't think either of us needed to make this a regular occurrence. She nodded, like she'd expected exactly that, and left a 20 on the counter for a $5 coffee. I didn't chase her down to return the difference. Some debts, I've learned, people need to overpay simply to feel like they've paid anything at all. Priya and I never had one clean, cinematic moment where we decided to become something more than 2 people who'd survived the same story from different sides of it. It happened instead the way most honest things happen, slowly, across 100 small ordinary evenings. Phone calls that ran later than either of us intended. A weekend she drove out just to see the diner in daylight and ended up staying 3 days instead of 1. 2 years after the story broke, she took a position at a paper close enough to Milbrook that the drive back and forth stopped making sense for either of us, and moved into the apartment above the diner that used to be Gigi's. Back before Gigi left for culinary school with a duffel bag and a hug that lasted considerably longer than either of us admitted to. Priya still edits with the same relentless honesty she brought to the story that changed my life, which means she is, without fail, the first person to tell me when a new recipe isn't working, and the only person whose opinion on that I've ever fully trusted. Gigi graduated from culinary school 2 Junes ago, top of a class of 40, and asked me, the night before the ceremony, whether I'd mind if she came back to Milbrook afterward to open a second location under the same name, a few hours down the coast, close enough to visit, far enough to be entirely her own. I told her the only thing that had ever felt true about that particular question, that the Kessler was never really about the building. It was about a door that stayed unlocked for exactly as long as someone needed it to. She could build that anywhere she wanted. She cried a little at that, which she'd deny if you asked her, and then immediately demanded I stop being sentimental and help her pick a location. The grass ring still sits in a drawer behind the register, stained dark, missing its daisy. I never threw it away, not out of sentiment for who I used to be, but because it reminds me, every time I open that drawer, exactly how far I've come from the boy who once believed a family's love was something you had to earn by disappearing a little more of yourself every single day. I don't need anyone's apology anymore. I got the truth instead, and it turned out, in the end, to be worth considerably more.